Israel's ambassador to the United Nations slams George Soros. Meanwhile, we have the latest on the efforts of the Israeli Defense Force to root out terrorists. This is Constable Confidential. I'm Simon Constable. Ben Weinthal, writing for Fox News and the Jerusalem Post and other distinguished publications, joins us from Jerusalem. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me on the show again.
Let's first deal with some news out of Paris that a German man was murdered by an extremist and two other people were injured this Sunday. That sounds like awful news, and we've got quotes from President Macron basically saying this is not good and this shouldn't be allowed to happen, and we will have the full force of the law going up against this criminal, alleged criminal, I should say.
Right. Well, the reports that I've read state that the man is of Iranian origin. He's French-born, and he's a committed Islamist.
Let's just for people not familiar, let's distinguish Islamist from Islam, because it is an important difference and it's a night and day difference, right?
Correct. That is a very important distinction. That's the distinction that I adhere to, namely that Islam is an ancient religion and part of the troika of monotheistic religions: Judaism, Islam, Christianity. But Islamism is a radical ideology that seeks to wage terrorism and destruction. So one does have to make that distinction.
Yes, and this gentleman, I'm reading this from the Times of Israel, saying that the man was 25 years old. There was a French citizen, had already spent, only 25 years old, had already spent 4 years in prison for a violent offense. We can assume that was something like grievous bodily harm or something like that. I don't know from the report here. But this is obviously someone with a history of that, and apparently he cried Allahu Akbar. God is great. Somebody's reporting in this story. This must be worrying that this is spouting up not just in Gaza, the anti-Israel, the anti-Jewish situation, but also other stuff.
Right. Well, it's not this type of radical Islamism. In this case, it's violent and it's horrible. And it resulted in you said the death of a German national. And what we've seen on the streets of other, major European cities, whether Berlin or London, as well as in New York, have been sort of mini movements of pro-Hamas supporters. So it's all very shocking. And what I did find interesting is that I saw an Iran International publication I write for, a diaspora publication that's been very critical of the regime. In fact, the Islamic Republic sanctioned this news organization as a terrorist organization because they're running scared of its reports. The Prince of Iran in exile,
that's
Reza Pahlavi.
Reza Pahlavi, yes.
Right, and I believe you recently interviewed him on your show.
Yes, I did. He's a very, very intelligent man.
Yeah, and I noticed that he immediately condemned the terrorism attack in Paris, and he said that I thought his comments were quite insightful. That the victory, he said, I'm quoting, "Victory over Islamist terrorism requires support for the Iranian people and the overthrow of the regime of the Islamic Republic ruling Iran, which for more than 4 decades has produced the political and ideological substance of Islamism and offers many terrorist groups around the world the material and financial means to commit their crimes." So he neatly captured what sort of was whirling around in my head, but he said it in a much more eloquent way.
And just to remind people, Hamas is funded partly by Tehran, and so is Hezbollah, and so are many other terrorist groups that operate largely in the Middle East and occasionally elsewhere. Now, we now know that the ceasefire or the pause in fighting is well and truly over. Israel has ordered more evacuations, and Israeli forces have found 800 shafts, underground shafts, this subterranean network, and they have destroyed 500 of those. So this is all going together. Can you talk us through this and what's been going on here? Because this is a big deal. It looks like Prime Minister Netanyahu is absolutely dead set on destroying Hamas at whatever cost it takes.
Right. Well, these 800 shafts are part of what is known in the Israeli defense and intelligence community as the Gaza Metro. That's been the name that's been applied within Israel to this this enormously complex subterranean tunnel system in Gaza underneath, of course, the earth, and it's really a mini city in many ways. And as we can see with the 800 shafts that have been found that connect to various strategic military assets of Hamas, according to Israel's defense forces. And it's a problem because Israel's military probably doesn't know how many more of these shafts exist. I mean, they're methodically moving their way through Gaza. There's been some talk, as I understand it, of pumping seawater into these tunnels, not filling them because there are still hostages in the tunnel, but the seawater would reach, I guess, the level of below your knee or your shin area, and that would knock out a lot of the Hamas's electricity and equipment, and hope from the Israeli security perspective, disrupt all the electronics underneath in this subterranean city.
Oh, we do know seawater is very corrosive, so it would go through an awful lot of stuff there. And you say they're methodically going through these tunnels, and I guess going from the north of Gaza down to the south. Now, Israel orders more evacuations from Gaza. A lot were originally told to evacuate from northern Gaza to the south. Now, those even in the south are being told to leave. And there's a fair amount of criticism coming in for that. Can you give us the detail on what's going on here?
Well, Israel is continuing the offensive to meet its war planning goal, namely to obliterate Gaza and ensure that it no longer rules the Gaza Strip. And what they've done is they've set up blocks within the Gaza Strip and are urging citizens who have been pushed into the south to move into these different blocks away from where they're trying to root out Hamas terrorists. So it's enormously complex. What I do find interesting is I have been following a number of urban warfare experts on social media, and I've been reading their articles in different publications. And a number of them have said, including Colonel Richard Kemp, who's very well known in Britain as the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, said Israel's going to great lengths, and many of these experts have never seen a military go to such lengths to ensure that civilians are not injured or killed through this early warnings, urging them to move into areas that are away from combat and giving them sufficient time. So this will, I'm sure, be the material of thousands of dissertations and studies at different war colleges and at West Point and Virginia Military Institute. There's no shortage of these types of institutes, but it is a point that I think has sort of been relegated to an inferior status in the reporting about how Israel is conducting its warfare.
Now let's move on from that to a fantastic story that you have just published with Fox News. And I'm going to read its headline. Israel's United Nations ambassador slams Soros, that's George Soros, the billionaire, for donations to pro-Hamas groups seeking the destruction of the Jewish state. Now, I should declare that George Soros is no friend to the UK, having broken the pound at 1 minute and made many hundreds of millions of dollars off that. What is he involved in this time, allegedly?
George Soros is a left-wing activist multi-billionaire. His estimated fortune is $25 billion, and he's pumped, according to numerous studies and investigations, over $15 million into a network of NGOs that
that's non-governmental organizations, just to make that clear, right?
Correct, that allegedly support Hamas. This is mainly the report I did covered a number of these non-governmental organizations that operate in the United States and have been spearheading the campaign against Israel to delegitimize Israel. And at the same time, according to a number of folks I've interviewed for the report, one woman wrote a book called The Soros Agenda, Rachel Ehrenfeld. This type of activity from the Soros, from George Soros and his foundation, the Open Society, helps to sort of whitewash the crimes of Hamas and mainstream it in a very way. It would be as if Soros was funding Al-Qaeda organizations or organizations that support Al-Qaeda or try to mainstream Al-Qaeda. In this case, Hamas, I don't think the comparison with Al-Qaeda is correct. I think the comparison, we discussed this on your show, I think, is better with the Einsatz group of the Hitler movement that went into Europe, mainly Eastern Europe, and were assigned to massacre Jews.
Yes, so we've seen lots of pictures of that were recorded, and it was just a hellish thing for everybody, really, and absolutely sinful to the nth degree there. So one of the things that I found interesting in your story was that quite a lot of the Jewish names, the names of the Jewish non-government organizations are misleading. For instance, you write, the Jewish Voice for Peace is actually a radical anti-Israel and anti-Zionist activist group that advocates for the boycott of Israel and the eradication of Zionism. This isn't meant to be flippant, but it sounds like a government name that where they put a new bill in Congress and say this is the Affordable Care Act, and healthcare suddenly is never affordable again. This really is quite shocking to me.
These organizations, as I said, are very misleading in terms of how they use their Jewish identities. Again, we're talking about two rather obscure organizations that are filled with a very small number of Jews, but they have a disproportionate voice right now in this campaign against Israel, and they also have a lot of money, from hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Soros Foundation or groups affiliated with the Soros Foundation that receive money.
That's partly the Open Society organization, right? The Open Society Foundation. Right. That is part of what Soros is funding, and that then channels money to these other groups that support organizations that want to destroy Israel, like Hamas. Have I got that right?
Correct. And this may sound a bit bizarre for your listeners, because there is a problem within the Jewish community. I'm talking about not only in the United States, but elsewhere, where you have a small number of Jews who are considered to be anti-Semitic. And it's something comparable to, there have been in the history of the gay movement, gays who hate gays, who are homophobic. The best example was Roy Cohn, that famous New York lawyer for the mob and for Senator McCarthy, who was a closeted gay man, and he issued very homophobic statements. And there are doctors who kill patients, and women who loathe women, who are misogynistic. And unfortunately, there's an illness or within the Jewish community where you have Jews who oppose the Jew, and their rhetoric amounts to anti-Semitism. And there's a famous comment from a satirist named Alexander Roda, who lived between 1872 and 1945. And he said famously, anti-Semitism could really amount to something if the Jews would just take charge of it. So in this case, we have, again, a handful of Jews who are using extremely anti-Semitic language, according to experts, to delegitimize Israel, but they're taken seriously because they're Jewish, and they say, and that's where Soros comes in and gives them money. And when
he's Jewish, and yet he's funding these organizations, or one way or another, the money is flowing from the Open Society Foundation to these other anti-Israel, anti-Jewish organizations. Can I just read, before we get on,
Sure.
Can I just read the quote that you got from the Open Society Foundation? Quote, any of our grantees have different perspectives and routinely disagree with each other, but our funding strategy, which has evolved over 20 years, is targeted towards working towards a secure future where rights and freedoms are respected. There is strict U.S. anti-terrorist legislation that determines which organizations a foundation like the OSF, the Open Society Foundation, can fund. We devote a lot of effort to ensuring full compliance. That is a bold set of statements. There's a lot in there, but let's go to one thing here, where they're saying working towards a secure future where rights and freedoms are respected. It seems to me, on the face of it, that Hamas was not defending rights and freedoms of the people who were kidnapped and the people who were murdered on October the 7th.
Correct. And I mean, what I found very interesting about my efforts to secure comments from the Open Society Foundation's spokesperson was the representative for Soros would not answer my, I think, probably three or four attempts, I think, in the end, to get an answer whether the foundation thinks Hamas is a terrorist organization. As you mentioned at the start of this call, the EU and the United States have both classified Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization, but the Soros, the Open Society Foundations would not say if Hamas is a terrorist organization.
And it's pretty clear that most people think it is, and it is an armed group that is heavily armed. We know that just in the same way that there are other organizations across the Middle East that are also armed. And most foundations that get money aren't armed. I know this from having lived in Britain and America. There are a lot of institutions that do work and are activist in many ways, but they don't walk around with machine guns and rocket launchers. Tell us more about this. Do you think this is going to change the government's view towards the Open Society Foundation in the US? Because that's where he is based, and the US government it seems to be increasingly taking notice of who is pro-Hamas and who isn't.
I suspect the intense media coverage, and there's growing media coverage of Soros and his organization funding groups that are pro-Hamas, probably won't influence a change in the behavior of the Biden administration. George Soros' son, Alexander Soros, has now just this year taken over the Open Society Foundations. He's very young, and he considers himself more political than his father. And many critics view him as just a mirror image of his father, but he's also has close ties to the Biden administration, Alexander Soros. So for purposes of power politics, given that money plays a very important role in the American political system, putting aside whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you have a family whose net worth is $25 billion, and they're very supportive of the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates. So I don't think there'll be any effort from this administration to crack down on George Soros's funding, or his son's funding now, for these different entities that support Hamas.
This is a fascinating story, and I would recommend everybody to go to the foxnews.com website and look at this story by Ben Weinthal. It is really, truly amazing. I'll give the headline again. Israel's United Nations ambassador slams Soros, that's George Soros, for donations to pro-Hamas groups seeking destruction of Jewish state. Obviously, that's a classic headline because a lot of the the articles have been left out there. But I would suggest that everyone take a look at that and draw your own conclusions on what you think. Is there peace within Israel at the moment? I know for a while there was a lot of problems with rockets coming in. Is that now over, or are we experiencing more on the other end?
Well, Hamas continues to fire rockets into central Israel, to the Tel Aviv area, since October 7th. We're now almost approaching 2 months into the war, and there was a terrorism attack here a few days ago in which 3 Israelis were killed by a Hamas operative in Jerusalem. And of course, Hamas ended the ceasefire by the terrorism attack and firing rockets into Israel. So the war, will continue. There are media reports out over the last few days. This will continue to move forward into 2014. It'll take as long as it takes to eradicate all of Hamas and its terrorism structure. And a lot of that, of course, is dependent on what the United States does. If the casualty numbers increase,
we're talking about civilian casualties within Gaza is what we're talking about here, right?
Correct. Will the Biden administration then twist Israel's arm or strong arm Israel to end the war? And that's what a lot of folks are sort of on the edge of their seats about, trying to assess how far can Israel continue to go. I mean, there are voices, of course, that say Israel should just ignore what the United States says because this is an existential war and it needs to be carried out.
We shall see what happens there. Thank you very much, Ben Weinthal, writing for Fox News Media and the Jerusalem Post and other distinguished publications. Thank you very much for being here. This is Constable Confidential. I'm Simon Constable, and that's it.